So I'm really excited to bring the stage. This is LC Cole. She's an international blockchain attorney with Blockchain Legal LLP. They're a distributed law firm that specializes in helping clients navigate the technology sector and regulation. And she's going to come up and talk to us about the wild, wild Web3 landscape. Please welcome LC to the stage.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here today. As Jesse said, I'm here to talk to you about legal. I want to thank Isaac and Cedric for having me. Happy to be here and help you guys. So they kind of brought me in to talk to you because for me, you all are developers, right? And it kind of panics me to think you guys are building these incredible things, but you don't know to stop and think about the implications of what you're building. So I like to talk to founders and builders about what it is you're building, why you need to care about what it is you're building, and how to protect it. Because you don't want to spend all the time building something to then realize you didn't protect it correctly, or you have exposures in legal areas and jurisdictions around the world, and you don't want to get stuck kind of getting trapped, getting fined, or having to close down shop, or losing your IP. So when I talk to builders, I like to think about the overall thing. You guys aren't lawyers. You don't need to be lawyers. This is why my whole industry exists. So you want to think about what you can ask me and how I can help you, because lawyers are facilitators. We're not the bad guy. I'm not the SEC. I'm not here to stop you. I want to help you build. And so when I speak to builders, I like to focus on big picture stuff that you can kind of understand why you need to talk to me. In America, or any jurisdiction, people care about what you're building because they care about the flow of money. So in any jurisdiction, whether you're in America or not, as long as geopolitical boundaries exist, money matters. And where that money moves and how that money moves matters in those jurisdictions. So you keeping that in mind kind of helps you frame why it is you need to care. Because no matter what jurisdiction you're in, they're going to care about how the money's flowing and who the money's flowing to. That's just kind of a good way to intro maybe why you need a legal wrapper, like a C Corp or an LLC, or a Cayman Islands Foundation, or a British Virgin Islands Foundation, or a legal wrapper in Singapore. You need to exist in some way because jurisdictions care about your existence in some way if you have something to protect. If you don't have anything to protect, if you're just a group chat, or if you're just a group of people sharing ideas, maybe that's not something to protect. But if there's money involved, if there's a shared wallet, if there's shared IP, if you're building something, you might want to consider protecting what you're building and how you want to protect it. So you may think this kind of rubs up against the idea of a DAO, because it's very much the ethos of shared knowledge, shared resources. No one's really in charge. The voting and the governments are all kind of neutral. And that's really great in theory, but that's really challenging when jurisdictions care about these things. Jurisdictions are bureaucracies. Every government is a bureaucracy. So they've got a list of rules, and this new tech has to fit into some of these rules. The US is a particularly challenging jurisdiction. We have a lot of agencies fighting over how to navigate this space. You have the SEC, the CFTC, the IRS, and I would argue that currently the IRS is probably the most savvy of those agencies when it comes to navigating this new tech, because they've added more resources, and as you can see from this year's tax return, the first question is, did you own digital assets? They're not hiding the ball that this is what they care about. They're making it very clear that digital assets and finding a way to capture that value is a significant priority for them. So you need to keep that in mind. The SEC obviously is the 900-pound gorilla in the room, right? So navigating that can be really challenging because what we're talking about is your token a security? Is your token, or is your governance token or NFT a security? And what is a security? So the SEC has defined security as an investment contract in this world that we're in of digital assets. They're taking the track of whether or not this exists as an investment contract under the security definition. And that really means there's a 4-part test under the Howey case, and that is an investment of money in a shared pool with a group of others with the expectation of profits under the management of others or through the use of others. So these are kind of 4 broad categories: an investment of money into a pooled asset of some sort with the expectation of profits through management or power of others. These are really broad categories under the Howey test, right? So even if you think investment of money is obvious, right? It's really not that obvious. Your investment of money can come through cash, being on any exchange, whether it's in the US or not. It can come through, even if you launch your token for free, you could be considered priming the markets if there's an expectation that it will be bought for money later. So there's a lot of tricks with that, even that first prong that seems really obvious. Is there an investment of money? The second one is to a shared pool of people. It's a group of people. Now there's some ways that you can kind of get around that if you're an investment club, meaning you're just this group of friends that's kind of pooling their cash together. That came from a case in the 1930s that was essentially this group of old ladies that just started sharing money and investing together. But it requires very specific small groups of people to kind of get around that particular element. Otherwise, if you're buying an asset as a group, you're probably sharing that in some way. And if you want to think about it at a high level, even when you start a company, if you issue shares, that's considered a security unless all the shares are going to founders. And even still, that's captured in your bylaws from your corporate documents. But if you have any sort of investor, that document, that safe note, that's your security. So even forming a company, the moment you issue shares, we're in the securities world. So that group pool idea is really what funds your company, and that's really where you need to focus on trying to think about how to navigate that zone while respecting the regulations that are out there. Then you have the idea that there's an expectation of profits. That's a little trickier because that's where utility comes in, or that's where governance comes in because you're sufficiently decentralized. And then you have through the management of others. And that's where DAOs become a little bit more powerful because you're even more decentralized. And you can argue maybe that this is so sufficiently decentralized that there's really not an expectation that others are managing this because the DAO as a whole is really navigating and moving this product forward. So keeping that in mind, there's a lot of nuance and ways that you have to navigate. That's just the SEC alone. And that's if these tokens or NFTs are considered securities. What if they're considered commodities? Now you've got the CFTC. Or you might have anti-money laundering laws that you have to deal with. Or you might have money transmitter laws if you're kind of a DeFi trading, or you've got money that's being housed in wallets that you're moving. Now you've got money transmitter laws, and those are state by state. So keeping all of this in mind, there's a lot to navigate when it comes to the legal side of starting what it is you're trying to build. And this is all really heavy lifting that you don't want to care about, right? Because you're trying to build this really cool thing that's changing the world, or that you want to execute this awesome idea, or you have this community of people that just wants to create something and see what happens. And I think that is so powerful, and I think that's why when you're working with an attorney, You want to find someone that sees your vision, and wants to help you execute it or find a path forward. Because it can get really sticky quickly. But with the right attorney who understands the tech and wants to help, there's definitely paths forward. And I think this is a good time to bring Jesse up to kind of talk about how maybe this all implicates specifically the ICP system, because it's a little bit different than some other chains out there.
Give it up for LC, everybody. So we're gonna like hang out on stage and have a little fireside chat. I'm gonna sit down. This is nice. Relax a little bit. I just want to remind everyone that all the food out there is being refreshed. So if you need to step out, grab a bite, do a little networking, please. Not obviously during this amazing chat, but later. Feel free. Laura, thanks again for joining us.
Absolutely.
I am very excited to plug you for information that I'm definitely going to use and might be useful to the crowd too here. So let's start out by digging into the SNS and the NNS. As you and everyone else here knows, the SNS is the new ICP Launchpad platform, and the NNS is our on-chain governance. So if you're building on ICP and in the future you think you're going to tokenize, you want to form a company, should you be thinking about like a C Corp or an LLC or nothing or in the Bahamas? Let's talk a little bit about like where should you, if you've got a new project and you want to form something, where should you be thinking about forming it if tokenization is in your future?
That's a great question. And I'm going to preface this with what I'll preface most answers with, the most lawyer answer of all time. It depends. So it definitely depends on where you're at in your company stages. If you're kind of already a little bit funded, if you're not funded, if you just have an idea, if you're just trying to pull together a collective. If you are just like two people with an idea that are building something, it wouldn't really make sense to go pay the like $50K to go offshore into Cayman because you're trying to launch a token. I think it makes a little bit more sense to just form an LLC to protect your ideas, to create a legal document that kind of captures the relationship between the people that are working on the product in a way that protects everybody, protects the ideas, and allows you to move forward with a little bit of seriousness because you took the time to have a legal wrapper, but not so much heavy lifting that you need to pull in an attorney immediately and like codify all your IP, trademark everything. It doesn't have to get that serious that fast. But as you kind of grow, I like to tell builders to just be thoughtful. And what I mean by that is where you're at today, touch base with what you think you need to protect legally. And as you grow and you get more stake in the game, you need to constantly think like, how do I protect this, or is it protected? So kind of just do a touch base where you're like, Did I build something? Is there funding now to protect? Is there more IP to protect? Am I seeking investor money? Am I talking to angel investors? Do I have enough of a community to kind of go for a launch? And each stage of that game, you might want to add a little bit more legal protection. So once you have an idea that's worth protecting and you've got like a fund on the line or a VC that's ready to cut a check, now you're looking more like a Delaware C Corp. That's generally what angel investors, VCs, and just general business like to see. Delaware has done a lot in business, protects a lot, and they're just a good state to incorporate in because there's a history of litigation and company-specific problems that they have taken the time to deal with that other states aren't as savvy on. So Delaware's a good state, but your home state might be a good state too. The states that have DAO legislation are, I would say, a really lovely attempt to create a conversation. But does that mean those states are where you should form your DAO? I wouldn't suggest, unless you have a compelling reason. Like if you live in Wyoming, maybe that's a good option for you. Mm-hmm. But if you're in Florida or another state and you think Wyoming's where you want to put your DAO because Wyoming wrote some statute related to DAOs, that might not be a good solution for you because a lot of DAOs are just Delaware LLCs as of today, as they kind of grow and develop.
Yeah. And for anyone that hasn't done it, if you want to form a business and base it in Delaware, it takes about 45 minutes to do that online. So if you use like LegalZoom or Stripe Atlas or something like that, that's like an off-the-shelf, like,
Just get something formed. If you have an idea that's worth protecting and you're working with someone, form something that protects both of you so that it's like a step forward in the relationship. You have a formal agreement to say you care about this thing you're building. And that makes it just having a little bit of skin on the line for you and those co-founders. And it also clarifies what happens if this kind of fizzles, or if a co-founder decides to leave and step out, but the other guys continue building. The amount of calls I get right now, because we're in such a crypto builders market, the amount of calls I get right now are where people had to quit because they got to go back to a day job to make ends meet. But there's a guy on the team that's like, no, man, I'm convicted, I'm building this. But they don't have a formal exit. So now that guy that's building it is super exposed because the other guy kind of gets to free ride a little bit and has arguable interest in what the other guy's still building because they didn't take time to protect themselves and because they didn't formally exit. And so I do a lot of like nuisance agreements where you kind of like, you have to pay the other guy out, just like a nuisance payment to be like formally gone because you didn't just think about what you were doing in the beginning. So the more you think about up front, even the light lifts, like just an LLC or a C Corp on LegalZoom, that can be such a light lift. But if you do it early on, then you can save yourself a $5,000 or a $10,000 nuisance payment to get that guy out while you're still building.
$10,000, you're getting off cheap for that payment,
Well, I mean, it's early on. Yeah. I'm a good negotiator.
Oh, okay, good to know. And you're available for hire if any. Okay, good. Yeah, and I mean, I can even speak from experience, like setting up these kind of contracts, they're not for when times are good, they're for when times are bad. And that you write these contracts and the hope is you put it in a drawer and you never need to look at it again.
Exactly.
But if you do need it, then you're not just making it up as you go along, you go back and that forms the basis for the partnership. So you have something to build off of.
Exactly. And a lot of times it's emotional when it's gone bad. So people get hot-headed and it can just get complicated really quickly. So it's just trying to be thoughtful along the way.
So let's go through an imaginary scenario where I have a recently formed Delaware C Corp, and I'm thinking about, as an American citizen, and I'm thinking about launching on the SNS. What should I be thinking about, and what concerns I should have?
Yeah, so you need to really think about why it is you're launching a token and not just kind of launching a product. Because if you're doing a token launch to raise money, that is a huge red flag for the SEC because the SEC was created as a way to protect investors, and that just means they are trying to protect people from investing in things they don't know about. So the SEC has the Regulation D and the Regulation S, depending on if you're in the US or if you're getting your money outside, and that was all created after the stock market crash. So what they're trying to protect is like a less savvy investor throwing money at companies that just come knocking on their door, or they see an ad for it and they're like, oh, that sounds like a great idea. And there's a lot of, unknown or uncertainty that kind of take advantage, like the idea of a rug. The idea of a rug is from the 1930s because that was super common back then.
They had NFTs in the 1930s?
I mean, they had the concept of rugging in the 1930s.
Sure.
Just in a more archaic form. And so when the SEC's kind of protecting you, they're doing it, but it is really restrictive. So you have to think, if the more that whatever you're doing looks like it's raising funds to build what you're promising, the more the SEC is going to really look at that with a microscope to make sure that you're ticking off every single box of not being a security.
Yeah.
And what that looks like is if you already have a formed product, then it doesn't really look like a raise, does it? Because if you have a product that if someone invests in it on day one, everyone's using it already. So the amount of users you already have on your product, if you can be like, my wallet has 30,000 daily users. This is where I don't know numbers because I'm not a builder, but 30,000 feels strong.
Great.
So if I have 30,000 daily users on my wallet every day, and I'm launching a token that's going to help build faster transactions in my wallet somehow, that's a good utility, use for the token. And it's hard to argue that I'm launching this token to build this wallet because it's already built and people are already using it. So that makes a harder argument for the SEC to be like, this was a raise, and you did a public raise, and you didn't keep it to just accredited investors. Because if you do a raise, you can do a raise, but you need to keep it to accredited investors.
Right. And can you just define an accredited investor
Yes.
for everybody?
Accredited investors are captured by a minimum threshold of wealth, not including your primary household, of over $1 million, or a minimum threshold of about $250K earnings a year for the past 2 years, with the perspective of it continuing in the future. And then there's like licensing thresholds and a couple other exceptions for the thresholds. But really, it's like if you're talking friends and family, then it's the 250 earning minimum or the $1 million wealth minimum aside from your primary dwelling. And so that kind of, I mean, I don't know about you, but that can really cut out a lot of people. And if you're not KYCing, knowing your customer, to know when you're dropping that token who's getting it, to ensure the SEC that those tokens are in fact going to accredited investors, you are pretty exposed, right? Like that's hard to mitigate for after the fact. But if you do things like mitigate in advance or ensure that your token's going to accredited investors, then you don't have to be so worried about a public raise. Private raises are a little bit more manageable because you can KYC a lot easier.
I mean, is it possible to KYC and have accredited investors on the SNS? I don't think that's...
this is where I'm not certain if that's out there. But a builder, if you build it, maybe it is a good tool.
I don't think that's currently possible under the current system. But again, the SNS is brand new and it's evolving and sort of it's going to move and change with these pieces. I'll just show my cards. I'm not an accredited investor, so don't hit me up for...
Look, there's not, I will say, it's hard to like make sure you're an accredited investor, especially in this market time, because, I mean, even your primary resident, look at housing markets right now. If you can't include your primary residence, then that threshold for wealth is significant.
Yeah. And so... but pulling money in via the SNS is not necessarily like having money come in as a part of that swap, which would inherently be a part of it. That's not immediately disqualifying either.
No, because it comes down to what that token is doing, which is a lot trickier, which is why you see, like, there's several thousands of tokens that aren't listed on Coinbase or Binance in the US because there's such a threshold to ensure that those tokens are at minimum likely arguably not securities. Now you're seeing the Coinbase take a step back. They're starting to delist some tokens because they were riding fast and loose for a while, allowing some to go through, and now they're trying to mitigate and undo some damage because they're about to take on the SEC in a significant way, and we're all rooting for them because what they do and how they get their answers will impact all of us, because there is a level of uncertainty right now in the US, which is why if you don't have to be here, you shouldn't. This is where the US is missing out, because they're playing their cards very strongly, but what they're failing to grasp is that it has never been easier not to be here. If you have real investors and you have a product they believe in, they will pay to go offshore and do this the right way, and the US will just miss out. And what that means is you'll miss out on the initial drop. So your tokens won't be available in the US. You'll have to geo-block and block VPNs. But if you've got an investor that believes, they'll pay, and they do. And that's what I do. I offshore companies all the time. And the US is just going to miss out until the tokens launched significantly enough, or the utility is strong enough, or there's sufficient decentralization to argue that the product is now not a security.
And if you are a U.S. company and you decide to offshore, does that provides more protection, or is the SEC just gonna be like, you're American, we don't care?
Well, the SEC will always find a way. I mean, pardon my French, it's like the long dick of the law will always reach as far as it can. So the SEC will always find a way. I don't think that's quite
how that phrase goes, but yeah, the SEC wants to fuck you. That's clear.
They'll reach as far as they can. And so they'll find ways. Like, I work with companies that are already offshore with no US ties that want that jurisdictional comfort analysis in the US because of how strong the US will go after if the token's being used in the US. So if you are a US company and you've taken the time to offshore and you're personally in the US, that leaves you pretty exposed. So chances are you'll take extra precautions and ensure that no VPNs are allowed and all the KYC is done until you reach a comfort threshold in that token where it is so arguably utilized that it can't just be a funding mechanism, or it's so sufficiently decentralized that it is truly a DAO and there's no one holding a big bag enough to impact or put their thumb on the scale of that operation.
All right, we're going to get really into the weeds here. So we have, known neurons that people follow on our NNS, our on-chain governance system. And ICDevs, which is one of the big ones, has been doing an automatic no vote on all SNS releases out of concerns for regulatory issues. Are they right? Are they wrong? Should we all be following ICDevs? Should we be telling ICDevs they're going about this wrong? Can you give a little sort of clarity? Can I, as a US citizen, vote for Kinix SNS, or am I putting myself at risk by not even investing, just voting for it?
Yeah, it gets really tricky. So having ICDevs as a known neuron, are those members known?
The members are known.
Like
it's associated with a US-based nonprofit.
Yeah, so out of an abundance of caution, they're probably just saying no until, because I think the SNS system is so fresh, seeing kind of how those launches go, out of an abundance of caution, they probably just said, we need a little bit more clarity before we move forward. And so cautionarily, they're just saying no, which is, that's not a bad legal approach to take. But in the future, will they always have to say no? Probably not. They might have to create some sort of threshold to be able to vote yes when it is a US issue. Because they're in the US and they're so obviously in the US, they're known, they do have to think carefully about what those votes mean and where they're going when they do say yes. What is the point of being an SNS and always saying no? What's the point of, what are they getting out of that?
Well, so to be launched on the SNS, it has to be approved by the NNS governance chain.
Yeah.
So it goes through the entire governance chain because the whole thing,
and they're the only ones saying no, always?
Well, lots of people say yes or no.
Yeah,
but because we have this follow system, so I'm team follow neuron. I don't believe in voting manually. I like having all my votes automatically done. So you set it to follow. So instead of me setting my vote every time, I follow you, and then whatever you vote, I follow you. So they've been out there telling people, if you follow us, we are going to vote no out of an abundance of caution.
Yeah.
But if they set up a meeting with you and said, hey, we're reconsidering our automatic no votes, what would be some of the things you would tell them to think about are there ways they could vote? And again, we're not even investing, we're just voting.
Yes if something gets launched.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting, it's a very cautious approach, but I think they're thinking probably about the system as a whole when in that vote and not just the fact that a yes or no can affect that particular company. I think they're thinking of it like yes or no affects the entire ICP network.
Yeah.
As in, if one of those tokens is in fact a security, they can at least say they didn't approve it.
Yeah.
So it's like plausible deniability. Will that argument fly with the SEC? Not if they have their way, but that's what Coinbase is fighting for right now. So that's why we're all rooting for them very hard. But I think that's a good cautious approach at the moment. They probably could reassess, but again, if they get into reassessing, then that's a more hands-on approach. And this is like the efforts of others, where it's like, because the system is so intertwined in its DAO essence, how much efforts of others? Because the system relies on you kind of staking your votes with someone else, like you're kind of relying on an effort of others there. So the decentralization argument, nothing in law is usually like binary. It's more like a scale. So like if we slide the scale where it's like you're less sufficiently decentralized because I'm relying on staking my votes with this other entity, then you need to increase, an argument in another field to kind of balance out your overall argument that this isn't a security. So it becomes really challenging to kind of constantly be tinkering with these levers that affect this overall picture. And I think that's probably what they're waiting on, is to see how the SEC reacts to the idea that people are it's a republic. You're adding your votes to a designated votee. And that system...
Kind of, because you're not permanently, you can change it at any moment.
Yeah, and that would be an argument I would make.
And you can manually override it as well. So you don't, it's out of laziness, right? It's out of convenience, and it's about an ability of sort of trust and following. So it is your own vote. You don't give them your vote.
Right.
You still make your own vote, but it's like a domino effect of their vote knocks your vote, and it cascades that way. But
I would argue that that's why it's not truly efforts of others, because you have that ultimate veto. But until you can prove how many people are actively utilizing that veto and truly engaged and actively participating in this decentralization, utilization of votes, it's harder to argue. Like, if you have a system where you're like, in theory, anyone can do this, in practice, 0.01 have ever done it, then that's going to be hard to win that argument in a court of law, because they're going to laugh at you. Just like when I say sufficiently decentralized, if the core team, there was a case in New Hampshire where the core team only kept 10% of the token, but because the token had a $1 billion cap, that meant that core team had 10 or 100 million tokens. And the court laughed at them and said, like, you as individuals can't utilize that many tokens on this platform. Like, in your lifetime, if you're doing transactions every day, you're not coming anywhere near utilizing that amount of token. You clearly are holding on to that as an investment, and because of that, this is the security. Now, it was a crappier court. It wasn't like the New York district, so it wasn't as strong of a court to kind of create this precedent across all categories. But the fact that that opinion's out there and that rationale is in the heads of judges should scare people a little bit to think, as a core team, as a founder, as we kind of continue launching it, and if my argument is really decentralization, then I need to think about how much can I truly hold on to with a straight face in light of these.
Yeah. So what can we put a pin in? What is sufficiently decentralized?
I mean, if we could put a pin in it, then you wouldn't need me.
Yeah.
Sufficient decentralization came from a speech that Gary Gensler made quite a few years ago, and has since kind of backtracked on, because we all love to hate Gary. He's the worst. And
boo.
So, boo for him. And so the fact that he's kind of backtracked on this is a nightmare of sorts, and also really frustrating, because we don't have, we have his words that we're kind of holding on to, and now he's like, yeah, but I was just kidding. And so that's incredibly frustrating to go with. But it just means that as a big picture, your DAO is truly operating in essence like a DAO. You have truly equal participation, active participation, and no thumbs on the scale or behind the shadows, which is hard to do when the jurisdiction requires mind and management. Like, you have to be an LLC or a C Corp to operate in the US without exposure, because if you don't have a legal wrapper for your DAO, by default, you're going to be considered a general partnership. And a general partnership is a nightmare, because you're jointly and severally liable for all members. That means if I personally declare bankruptcy, that shared wallet is available to my creditors. So if I just run up a bunch of bills, declare bankruptcy, and there's like $100,000 in a shared wallet, my creditors can go after every penny of that and get it. They'll have a right to it if they have their lien correctly filed. That's scary. That's why you don't want to have that kind of exposure. That's why you want a legal wrapper. But having a legal wrapper kind of goes against the ethos of a DAO and being sufficiently decentralized if you kind of have to avail yourself of a core mind and management team. So riding that balance of doing these things in a decentralized way, giving power to a core group without ruining your sufficient decentralization argument is very hard, and it's a lot of writing on my part, but I work really hard.
So let's say you are decentralized enough, then what should you be thinking about in terms of regulation concerns then? That if you are let's assume you're genuinely decentralized, you don't keep any tokens, or you keep 1%, or you really do get to a place that we all say, okay, this is clearly decentralized. So what are can it be regulated at all? What jurisdiction does it fall under then? Because a DAO doesn't exist as a legal entity outside like Wyoming, basically.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, there's a few other states, I think Vermont, Tennessee, New Hampshire, Utah, they have some DAO legislation. But even with a legal wrapper, if you've reached that decentralization level, arguably then you don't have to worry about securities as much as long as you continue to build, which is the argument that was made that Ethereum, if the foundation doesn't exist, people will still build on Ethereum, and Ethereum will still exist, and by that way, will still have value. So the value of that token will exist without the foundation and without kind of any sort of heavy hand weighing in, because there's enough people building on Ethereum that it can stand alone without an external force. That's kind of how you have to think of sufficiently decentralized. So if you kind of reach that level, then you're more worried about whatever it is you're building, because you can still have a legal entity, and you should, even if you're a DAO, because there's still IP to be had unless you're truly open source. And even still, you might have something you want to protect, like your brand or some copyright if you have logos or something, which we haven't even touched on, but we can get there. We've got time.
You're a logo designer in addition to
No,
a blockchain
I'm saying you
attorney?
need to protect your logo.
Oh, okay.
How to protect your brand or your logo.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you kind of just have to, once you've navigated one area of the law, then it's just running a business kind of, and ensuring that DAO is, able to keep its ethos, keep its product moving, and exist with hopefully self-sufficiency and autonomousness.
All right, so show of hands, who here has ICP staked on the NNS right now? So all of them. What are the implications of participating in a staking system and the staking rewards that we all should be probably thinking about before this point?
Yeah. So staking is, again, we're back to like that efforts of others and whether or not staking makes it a security or not. But also, first and foremost, staking is rewards, and those rewards are monetary, and the IRS probably rarely cares about that. So how you capture them and account for them in your taxes is probably the #1 priority, because like I said, the IRS is probably the most savvy government agency in crypto right now. And they've very purposely situated themselves that way, because 2021 may have been the year of the NFT, but 2024 will be the year of the audit. And they're coming. They're coming in hot. They're coming in with like regulations that they're thinking through. They've got company lines to state to the public, and you're going to start seeing positions from the IRS come out on how stuff will be treated, and those taxes will really start to matter. So keep that in mind. Staking, make sure you're capturing those rewards accordingly and accounting for them if you're in the US.
But if I have a VPN, that's enough though, right? That covers me?
I would not say that makes you safe. I would say that it's at your own risk, but because you have to remember that the blockchain is transparent and a permanent record. So what we know about government is that it is slow as hell, but it is inevitable. They get theirs every time. They just will. So whether it takes them 4 years or 10 years, that record will remain. And once they connect you to that record, it's over. And now you've looked like, because you had a VPN, now you've looked like a bad actor. So those penalties and interest will crush you. And it's rough. So it's better to be upfront and forward, because the IRS and government as a whole is inevitable, and they hate bad actors. They just do.
So let's talk about copyright a little bit. So like we've had some issues with like someone put up like a Nintendo emulator on ICP, and there's been some other copyright issues. Who's responsible for hosting copyrighted material on a decentralized system?
That is where it gets really tricky because it's who you can capture. In reality, it's like who's responsible for this? It's whoever that can be tagged to it. So if the operator of the node is known, then they can be tagged to it. But even if they're not known, there's been cases in Florida and New York where they've allowed service of process for a lawsuit to occur via an NFT airdrop to an unknown wallet because they've connected that wallet to the action that they've found to be illegal, and that's the only thing they know about that entity or that person. So they served the NFT via airdrop to a wallet as notice. So even if you're unknown or you're anonymous, you can still be served. Now there's a group that has declined to acknowledge that service. So that's kind of being hashed out. But inherently, this is still, like, there's still Web 2 laws. Like, original laws apply. You can't rip off copyrights. You can't rip off trademarks. And to tell you the difference, copyright is the actual art, and trademark is the brand. And you protect both, but really what you see is brands protect brands because you have to. If Nike doesn't always protect Nike, if Nike lets some little guy go because he's little and they don't want to look like a big bad company going after a little guy doing some small beans thing on the side, that's called brand dilution. And so future trademark enforcements will be harder to enforce because Nike didn't take the time to enforce their trademark as a whole. So that's why you see companies so aggressively protect their trademark, because legally they kind of have to, or their brand gets diluted and it's harder to argue that it should be protected.
I've been on the both giving and receiving end of those cease and desists around brand, and it's all a pile of trash, and I hate it all.
It is frustrating.
Yeah, well, it just feels like I've seen a lot of people use that excuse of brand dilution for being way too aggressive.
Oh, yeah.
Too. And in fact, even in my experience where we were the ones protecting our brand, once that moved forward, we couldn't back out of that process.
No,
now,
you can't.
Because then it
see
becomes there will be a winner and there will be a loser, and if we back out, then we're now the loser, and it was a nightmare.
The trademark, I would say, I mean, I'm in blockchain law, which is a complication of a different kind, but I honestly think IP, which is like trademark and copyright, can be some of the most complex areas of law to practice because it can just be so nuanced.
And should you be running out to put a copyright or a trademark on logos? Should that be like a day one priority, or is establishing prior art sort of enough and you can come back around to that?
Yeah,
as you're more
so it depends on how many competitors or how great of an idea. If that's a word that you think
really
no one's
idea.
trademarked yet, or that someone, it's like, how has someone not trademarked this phrase or this word, and you want to capture it quickly, it might be a good idea to protect it day one. You do have some initial rights, like even if you're not using it yet, you file an intent to use. And so you have to prove that you're about to use it within a certain period of time, and you file your trademark that way. Or if you've been using it and you're ready to file it, it will relate back to the date of first public use or first trade use. So, you know, if there's a financial element to it. If you're just kind of displaying a brand, that's arguably not as much of a trade use, but if you're displaying it on a website where you can buy something, then that would be what it dates back to is the first date of trade use. And so even if you're using a brand or a trademark, you don't have to do it right away. A lot of IP attorneys will be like, yeah, you have to file day one, but it can be really cost prohibitive, especially if you're going to pivot. You know how many of you are founders of different companies? How many times has your product pivoted? Right? You pivot a lot as a founder. You get this great idea and you start talking to people and you're like, oh, I gotta turn right here. So if you have this brand and trademark works in categories. So if I trademark in category A, And then like 6 months later, I'm pivoting to category B. Man, did I waste some cash trademarking for category A when I should have been in category B? So there's arguments to kind of waiting until you settle in because it dates back to first use. But again, if it's an idea that or a phrase that you're like, oh my gosh, this is like impossible to not do right away because someone's totally gonna do it, then it can be arguable to like go trademark it today. But for example, my username is Learned Chaos, and I'm very much like, that's me. I have that username on everything. And so I could trademark Learned Chaos, but there isn't a lot of incentive today because I don't have, other than my law practice, I don't have a brand around it. But should I ever start selling like Learned Chaos tokens? Yeah, I'll trademark it then.
So Learned Chaos swag coming soon.
Yeah.
All right, we have like 2 minutes left, so just a real quick, simple question to wrap us up. What is the biggest legal hurdle facing ICP moving into the future?
I think it's the unsettled status in the US. Once we get Coinbase fighting hard and everybody submits their like amicus briefs to say, fuck you, SEC, you're wrong, then I think we'll have a little bit more clarity on where we're headed and what we can and can't do with cleaner lines. Because I honestly think the idea of the SNS and the NNS where you can not delegate votes, but you can more passively engage, I guess, this great way of being like, you're taking the lead, but I still can participate, is a great way to have a protocol and to help others launch and to build actual community while building cool things. So I think there's a future there, but with this sort of status of a gray world that we live in, it's going to be hard to full steam ahead without any sort of worries, but there's always paths forward, and that's what me and my firm do every day is we really always try and find a path forward.
Well, this is the brilliance of being an attorney, is after an hour of this, I have more questions than when I started with, and that's how my billing gets run up. All right, give us like the final word here. What should we be thinking about into the future?
Well, you should be thinking about calling me or somebody like me, but also you should just be thinking about being thoughtful as you build. You guys are so smart, and you have such great ideas, and you should succeed in those ideas, and I would hate for anything like your corporate formation or your tax implications or your regulatory navigation to be something that holds you up, because you do have great ideas, and like you should be building all of that together and continue doing that because it's just so great.
LC, everybody. Thank you so much. That was awesome.